Right, let's kick off with a question which was sent in via newstatesman.com/you ask us. And this is from Daniel Rust, who asks, will a children not in school register, as proposed by the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill, actually make any children safer? Now, this is the idea of a register of children who are not in school, which was also pledged by the Conservatives, but it's being taken forward this week by Labour. It's part of a bill put forward to Parliament on the same day that the father and stepmother of 10-year-old Sara Sharif were sentenced to life in prison for her brutal and utterly sickening murder. Anyone who's followed the case has probably been moved to tears over it. Sara had been taken out of school months before she died, but the family had long been known to the local council. So Daniel asks, will this idea of a register help, or is it bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake?
Hannah, you've written a lot about this case. Like, what do you think? Do you think it would have helped?
I think for sure it would. And you know, it's not bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake. It's a weakness that has been in the system for many, many years. I mean, I wrote, while the trial was ongoing, about a case that I'd covered many years ago in Birmingham, 16 years ago now, about a young girl called Kyra Ishak, who was starved to death by her family. And something very similar had happened, that concerns started to be raised. As a consequence, she was taken out of school and then disappeared off the radar. So it's not at all suggesting that people who homeschool their children are abusing them, but certainly it has allowed this loophole where seemingly no one goes to check on these kids. It has allowed families that sadly are mistreating their children to get away with it. So I do think it's a good measure. It's massively late, but you know, of course, it won't fix everything.
It's a coincidence that this initiative is being brought forward at the time when the father and stepmother of Sara Sharif are convicted and sentenced, and this is something that the Conservatives were pushing forward, and they were worried also about the thousands of children who have dropped out of school during lockdown and during the pandemic. There was a sort of sharp rise in children not returning to school.
Some statistics on that are quite staggering. So if you compare GP registrations with school and registered home education, the Education Policy Institute found up to 300,000 children may have been missing from education entirely in 2023. And that was a 40% increase on 2017. I mean, it's enormous.
So a lot of the measures in this bill are designed to keep track of children. So to give them a number, like you have a national insurance number, that is the same for healthcare, for schools, for if they're known to social services. And so you can track them through the system, because what happens at the moment is the schools have their own information, the council has its own information, obviously the GP will have information, social services may have information, and making them all match up is really challenging, and sometimes children fall through the cracks. And I think you're right to describe the homeschooling situation as a loophole. Obviously, lots of parents take their children out of school and homeschool them for very genuine, positive reasons. But it does seem to be a loophole that if a child is suffering neglect or abuse and the school notice it, the parents or the caregivers can just choose to take the child out of school, and then suddenly there's no one looking out for that child. That is clearly a loophole that is going to be exploited by the worst possible people. So having some kind of register and database and going, okay, let's just try and work out who these children are and track them through the system, that has got to be part of the solution to this absolutely horrific case. And the other thing that it will do, hopefully, is tackle so-called illegal or unofficial schools, which are faith schools often, which are not registered at all. And
Ofsted have no power. Inspect.
There are an estimated 6,000 children who are attending these institutions that aren't really school, and it's not really homeschooling either. And the government currently doesn't really have any power over what gets taught in them, or there are no safeguarding provisions. They're not under the main school safeguarding umbrella. So it's a way to keep track of those children as well.
No, for sure. And you know, nothing is going to be foolproof. And in fact, I think the bill's suggesting that those children who are under child protection plan, those families would not have a right to educate at home. But
as
far as I know, actually, I don't think Sara Sharif was. But I think anything that raises awareness of this and actually sort of focuses minds, it can only be a good thing. I don't think it's a gimmick. I genuinely don't. I think they're trying to do something for the good. George, this bill actually contains quite a lot of other stuff as well, including free breakfast clubs in primary schools, limits on branded uniforms, which I think many parents would welcome. But one of the features that's stood out a bit is this shift in the view of academies, if you like. And the Conservatives have certainly come out in fierce opposition to it. Laura Trott from the Tories called it educational vandalism. Can you just... What do you think it's telling us about Bridget Phillipson and the Labour government's attitude towards schools and their role?
I think it's very striking that obviously it's a move to empower local authorities again, to roll back some of the freedoms the Conservatives introduced. One thing which strikes me is Bridget Phillipson's adopting a very different model of public service reform to Wes Streeting. Wes Streeting is encouraging greater use of the private sector in the NHS, introducing NHS league tables, whereas in education we've seen the abolition of one-word Ofsted verdicts. We're seeing academies lose some of their freedoms. We're seeing perhaps a stronger role for teaching unions, whereas Wes Streeting's already clashed with some of the health unions. Now, from a big picture perspective, you could say the Conservatives introduced a lot of school reforms. There's been less reform in the NHS, partly because the Conservatives got burned by the Andrew Lansley experience. But it will be very interesting to see which model proves more successful in terms of delivering results, because that's ultimately how you will judge both schools and the health service. It also suggests there isn't necessarily a sort of consistent approach to public service reform across the government. And I think that reflects some of the sort of wider tensions over what does this Labour government really stand for? Are they resurrecting a Blairite-style agenda for public services, or is it a more soft left one?
I mean, Laura Trott described this view of academisation. I'm not going to get into the weeds of it, but she said it was rowing back on 20 years of political consensus, actually. She's talking about Blair and, of course, the Conservative years. Is that a bit of an oversimplification?
I think so. In terms of New Labour, obviously initiated the City Academies programme. What Michael Gove did was really put rocket boosters under it, to the point that the majority of secondary schools are now academies. You have seen school results improve. It's actually one of the better aspects of the Conservatives' record, but Labour think there are questions to be asked about lack of accountability and a lack of a role for local authorities.
I just do think it's interesting that, as George said, schools, or literacy and numeracy rates in particular, are one of the few things that Conservatives could point to as a success from the last 14 years. I mean, they don't have a lot of successes to point to, and they didn't talk about it nearly as much in the run-up to the election.
About it. Well, our kids have just done really well, and they're not singing their praises either.
So I think there are clearly huge issues in schools policy, and there's huge issues in things like, buildings, and the fact that the schools have used concrete that means the ceilings are falling down. And there are massive issues when it comes to SEN provision and the amount of support that schools and local councils are expected and need to provide to those children. So
that's special educational needs, and I think we call it now SEND, don't we? Special educational needs and disabilities.
It's not that everything is wonderful and rosy in the world of schools, certainly not. But it does seem that the academy issue is not necessarily what has been driving some of those other challenges. So I think a lot of people will find it maybe not strange, but they will sort of look at Bridget Phillipson's decision to tackle that as a political one, as an ideological one, rather than we need to desperately solve this challenge.